And for a lot of women, this really freaks them out because going back to our culture, it's like we're kind of taught that we need to separate, our sexuality, that part of our lives from motherhood.
I'm Heather Grzych, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrzych.com or on Instagram at heathergrzych. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Bailey Gaddis, who's the author of Asking for a Pregnant Friend and Feng Shui Mommy. She's a childbirth preparation educator, a birth doula, and a hypnotherapist, and a regular contributor to media outlets including Working Mother, Fit Pregnancy, Pregnancy and Newborn, Cosmopolitan, Woman's Day, Disney's Babel, and more. And she also volunteers for a program where she offers in-home support to parents of newborn babies, specifically single mothers and those with babies with special needs. Thanks so much for joining us today, Bailey.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
So, Bailey, I love the subtitle of your latest book, Asking for a Pregnant Friend, 101 Answers to Questions Women Are Too Embarrassed to Ask About Pregnancy, Childbirth, and Motherhood. And I think this is a really brave book because it's not, oriented in this kind of super clinical, here's what to expect, boring format. Like it actually goes after the real stuff that comes into our minds when we feel something or have a question about something, and it might be a little bit too embarrassing to ask somebody about it. So this is going to be a fun interview. Could you tell us about your book, Asking for a Pregnant Friend, and what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, absolutely. So the seed was planted during my pregnancy with my son 8 years ago. I didn't know the seed was planted at the time, but I had a lot of questions come up that I found to be really embarrassing, some that produced a lot of shame, and I talked to no one about them. And there was even some questions I didn't fully acknowledge I even had. I just shoved it all down. I just ate the shame and moved forward. And then when I became a childbirth preparation educator, a doula, I started to have women ask me those same questions that I had been too embarrassed to ask. So I realized, okay, there's something here. I'm not the only one, which was so incredibly liberating and helped to release some of that shame. And then I thought, okay, well, if these women that I'm working with had these questions, if I had them, I'm sure there's likely thousands of other women trying to explore these topics. So I decided to create a book that created a safe space for women to get, accurate, compassionate information about these topics that can be really tricky to explore.
I mean, I guess it's definitely tricky for most women to explore, but if you were going to give a percentage of women who felt sort of shy about asking some of these questions, what would you guess is the percentage of women who might be shy to ask some of these questions?
Oh, I would say about 80%. I was talking to a lot of girlfriends who are very, very open. They're women that when I was asking them about, ideas for this book, I would have thought they would have said, oh yeah, I asked everybody these questions. It was no big deal. But even these women are like, yep, nope, I was embarrassed about this. I didn't even want to admit it, to my doctor, to my best friend. So yeah, I would say probably about 80% of us feel that embarrassment, which a lot of times can shut us down.
And it's interesting because the book covers the pregnancy experience, the birthing experience, and then what it's actually like to be a mother and have a baby and experience that whole aspect as well. And it seems that women these days approach their birth experience or their mothering experience differently than each other, and maybe even differently than maybe our moms and our grandmas did. Speaking about birth, right? Some women are just like, give me the C-section. And others are like, no, I trust my body. I could do it without any drugs. And then there's others who say, okay, I'm just going to go with whatever the doctor recommends. And then there's obviously lots of people reading stacks of books and things like that. But then of course, at the actual moment, it's like best laid plans because, things don't always go as planned. But what do you see in terms of, do you see some changes happening in how women are approaching their birth experience today versus in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. Number one, and this is happening slowly, but I'm seeing this be infused more and more, is a sense of empowerment and a little bit more autonomy. So when you mentioned, yeah, I'll just do whatever the doctor says, that really used to be so much more prevalent. So I was talking to my mom about it, who had babies over 30 years ago. And she's like, oh yeah, back then, pretty much everybody just listened to the doctor, and home birth was not a big thing. And so, yeah, the empowerment piece, women saying either, yeah, like I'm going to try for a home birth, or I'm going to have a hospital birth, but I want to have a voice. I'm going to create those birth preferences. Or the women that say, I want to have a C-section and that feels good to me. So I think that is so great. And then, going back to the home birth, that is slowly becoming more common. A home birth, birth center, people are starting to realize that, if a woman is healthy, if the baby is healthy, that environment, if you have a professional midwife and attendants, can actually be an incredibly safe environment. And obviously it's not right for all women, but yeah, I think there's just more choice, and there's starting to be a little bit less judgment with women making a choice that isn't just like, I'm going to the hospital and I'm getting the epidural, because for a long time, that was really the choice. Even when I was pregnant 8 years ago, pretty much everybody I talked to said, well, you're going to get the epidural, of course, right? And at first I was like, well, I guess so, because that's what everybody's telling me. And then I learned about hypnobirthing, which is what I teach, and ended up having an unmedicated hospital birth. But yeah, even just really in the past 5 years, I've seen more and more openness with women realizing that they don't need to birth the way their mother did, the way their best friend did, that they have the choice. They can listen to their body and they can trust their instincts.
Yeah. And it seems like the theme of fear and worry are certainly big themes that come up for women on this journey. And they're big themes of, I think, both of your books. And both Feng Shui Mommy and Asking for a Pregnant Friend, I would agree, that there's a lot of fear around this. But
yeah,
why do you think this comes up so much for women, this fear and this worry around having children?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's, a few different reasons. One of the big ones is our culture. There is, in so many ways, a culture of fear around the birthing experience, and when you think of how birth is typically depicted, specifically in the media, even if it's supposed to be funny, it's usually like the woman and she's screaming and she's yelling at her partner, and it looks incredibly traumatic, so for a lot of women, these are the images that we are exposed to with birth. And actually, I was talking to one of the women that runs hypnobirthing, and they have these beautiful birth videos that are so calm. And they tried to get them on, this reality show about birth. And the producer said, nope, they're too boring. The women are just like sitting there, just birthing. It's way too boring. So again, we're just really not exposed to any alternative to those fearful images. So there's that. There's also, a lot of really scary birth stories that a lot of us hear. And women a lot of times wear their traumatic birth stories like a badge of honor. And I understand women wanting to share and process those stories. But when you're the woman that's pregnant, you haven't birthed before, hearing these scary stories can fill you with a lot of fear. And of course, there's the big one, the unknown. If you've never birthed before, it is this giant unknown. And no matter how many books you read or classes you take, of course, you don't know exactly what birth is going to be like, how your body responds to birth until you're actually in it. So there's, a big fear triggered from that. And that's why I really dive deep into that topic, in both of the books, to help women work through that so the fear doesn't control the experience. It's hard to completely remove it, but when we know what it looks like, what it feels like, and how to work through it, it can really transform the pregnancy and birth experience.
Well, it seems like there's no doubt this book is going to help someone who is pregnant or thinking about becoming pregnant and getting ready for birth, and maybe even after they've had this child and all these weird thoughts are coming up and they're experiencing all these weird things that they've never felt before. And there are a lot of questions in this book, Asking for a Pregnant Friend, that I wish I'd asked somebody to just even tell me what the experience was like before I had a child. And, something, for example, like breastfeeding, I think you do a great job covering a lot of the weird questions around that, because it is a really weird experience, and it's one that you do for a long time and you choose to do it and you have an active role in it. Whereas like making the baby, like it's like nature that does that, right? Once we make it, it's like we just have to eat and then the baby is made. Like this breastfeeding thing, it's really something we are actively involved in, and it's sometimes painful and oftentimes very lovely. And I think it could be really cool to give, especially people listening who haven't had a child yet, a little peek into what breastfeeding is actually like. So I'd love for you to, cover perhaps one of the more taboo questions you addressed in your book, which is question 89, which is about like, I'm paraphrasing your question, but that question is essentially about like, why is breastfeeding sometimes so pleasurable, actually?
So with breastfeeding, I mean, number one, we're told, oh, it's the most natural thing in the world sometimes. And when it doesn't feel natural, that can be really frustrating. And in regards to that question, when you first hear about it, like, oh, like having pleasure during breastfeeding, that sounds amazing. But this can really trip women up, because what can happen is they have these feelings of pleasure that they equate to the feelings that they have during sex or when they're aroused. And for a lot of women, this really freaks them out, because going back to our culture, it's like we're kind of taught that we need to separate, our sexuality, that part of our lives, from motherhood. But of course, especially if you had sex to get pregnant, I mean, obviously it's intertwined, right? And so when you breastfeed, what happens is the hormone oxytocin is released in your body. And this is something that is often also released when you're having sex. And this creates, we call it the love hormone. It creates a feeling of connection with your baby, or again, your partner, if you're having sex. And then there's nipple stimulation, right? That's a huge part of breastfeeding. And for any woman that has not breastfed before, really the only association they have with nipple stimulation is typically sex. And so all of a sudden you have this nipple stimulation, but it's being caused by your baby when you're feeding them. And it throws women for a loop, and they start to think, oh my God, do these feelings mean that I'm having sexual feelings towards my baby? And so what I tell women, what I talk about in the book, is all you're experiencing is a very normal, natural, biological response to the act of breastfeeding. It's caused by that release of hormones, by that nipple stimulation. And some women, and again, this feels really taboo for, a lot of women to talk about, is if you have your legs crossed during breastfeeding, that can create some clitoral stimulation. And there are a lot of women that actually experience orgasm during breastfeeding, which, unfortunately, most women, when that first happens, they don't enjoy it. They completely freak out that that is happening in their body. So, my main message with that is, again, remember, it's not about sexual feelings towards your baby. It's biology giving you this beautiful gift. Actually, it's a way to encourage women to continue breastfeeding if they think, okay, when I breastfeed, I have these amazing sensations in my body. Let's keep doing this. So to remember, it's just, biology giving you a big kiss, and nothing wrong or abnormal happening in your mind.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because the same body part can have more than one action and one function. And if we're used to it, having one function and it has another one, then it could be really confusing for people. But I'm like, what do you say? Does this come up more for Catholic people?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's so funny. I had a woman and she's like, oh my God. I'm like, she was Catholic. She's like, I am really like having a hard time, processing this. So yeah, religion, I mean, there's all sorts of things that can make it even more of this like shame inducing experience. Totally.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing this. And what are some of the other taboo questions that come up for women in these experiences?
Yeah, so I have one exploring, the phenomenon of partners straying during pregnancy, infidelity. I didn't know it was such a big thing, so I dive into that in the book, about 10% of partners stray. And I go deep into it because I don't want to just freak women out thinking, oh my God, is that another thing I need to be worried about? But I just create an avenue for women to explore that, especially if that's something they've been nervous about. I have one that I specifically got from one of my friends. And the question is, I think kids are irritating. Does this mean I'll be a bad mom? And I had a friend that she's like, I don't love being around kids, but I'm pregnant. Oh my God, am I going to be the worst mom ever? So I go into that. Being really turned on, being really aroused during pregnancy. Some women, they feel like they want to masturbate all the time. So we look at that, what's going on there. Diving in, back into motherhood, a question about feeling resentful of the baby, getting all of the attention, feeling invisible, how to navigate that, finding it boring to take care of a baby, how we get through that. One of the ones that I really spent a lot of time researching and working with two psychologists on is the question, I have horrific thoughts about awful things happening to my baby. Sometimes I imagine being the person inflicting harm. Am I crazy? Am I a danger to my baby? So I really dive into where those thoughts come from, what's causing it, and how to receive support. For that in particular, a lot of times those thoughts are caused by, postpartum anxiety, postpartum OCD, which is actually incredibly common. And a lot of women are afraid, to be open about this because they think this is going to cause, the doctor or whomever I'm opening up about to think that I, do pose a risk to my baby. And so with the psychologists I worked with, they're like, one of the big important factors with these thoughts that are so normal, almost all new moms have some scary thoughts like this, is that as long as you recognize that those thoughts are wrong, that you don't like them, that they make you uncomfortable, that you're fine. It's when the very, very rare when women actually go into a state of postpartum psychosis and they don't understand that those thoughts are wrong and they convince themselves that, yes, this is a good thought, I should move forward with it. So anyways, it's a very complex issue and I really try to provide accurate information about it in the book. And again, have a jumping off point for receiving support. Because of course it's unpleasant, even if we know it's normal. So I could go on and on about, about all the questions, but we're top of mind.
I think it's really helpful to address that and, this idea that we can have some weird thoughts sometimes, and we can have some weird thoughts even when we're not in this phase. And, I think the thing about thoughts is one thought that pops up for 1 second, which you do nothing about, nothing wrong with that, right? Thoughts that keep repeating, you got to watch those, right? And then also thoughts that you act on, right? So, but the idea that you even observed that thought is actually kind of an advanced move for people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm so happy that you brought that up. And it's interesting listening to you talk about some of these taboo subjects. Some of them I'm like, oh man, I really feel like I really missed out on some of those things, like crossing my legs or whatever.
Yeah.
But frankly, I found it very, well, not boring because it was hard, but I was used to a lot more stimulation and being out in the world and doing things. I was teaching yoga classes like up until a week before I had my kid, and I was seeing clients and everything. And so when I had a baby, I was bored, and I actually started day trading. I taught myself how to trade on the stock market.
That's so cool.
But it is a real thing, I think, especially like if you're used to doing things. That was of the taboo subjects that you brought up. That's one that I really, really, really related to. And, another question I recall from your book is, I think this comes up a lot for people, during and after having a kid and before even, because it seems like everybody comes out of their own childhood experiences with stuff, right? And I think this is like question 81 in your book. And it's the question, I'll read it. It says, I had a horrible childhood and I'm afraid I'll replicate that with my child as I have no good parenting role models. Am I destined to be a bad parent? I'd love for you to talk a little about this question.
Yeah, so this came from two friends in particular that had really traumatic childhoods. And when they went into parenting, there were a lot of blocks and again, a lot of fear that they would replicate, what the childhood that they had. And so again, going back to the psychologists, we really went in deep on this question in particular, looking at, okay, well, number one, are these people, at a higher risk of replicating that experience? And what we found is, and this isn't surprising, I mean, of course, we're all unique people. And just like kind of the question with, the postpartum OCD, those scary thoughts, is just acknowledging that you're having this fear and starting to explore it is such a huge step, so with people that are so aware that their childhood maybe wasn't ideal, they're already, so far ahead because, again, they realize it and they can start pinpointing, okay, well, what was it about my childhood that I really didn't like or that was traumatic? And so I offer, all sorts of steps that, again, these psychologists helped me come up with. And yeah, so that's one of them, really acknowledging what it was that I want to do different. Starting to seek out new parenting role models. We don't have to just have our parents as our role models. You might have a sibling or a friend who you think, wow, like I love the way that they parent. I love the choices they're making, and starting to explore what they do, seeking books, really becoming a student of parenting. And again, not feeling like you need to completely follow somebody else's recipe, but really exploring and finding new ideas and building your own way of parenting and realizing that you absolutely can do that. Nobody is destined to repeat, their own childhood. Because again, their parents are different people. They were raised by different people. They came up in a whole different culture in many ways. So again, just taking back that sense of autonomy and knowing that you have the power to create a new experience for your children. And then, of course, also being aware, it's like, okay, maybe one of my parents had anger issues, and that's something that I feel within myself sometimes. So that's something that I'm going to maybe seek counseling for, or just be aware of, notice if I get triggered and develop tools to work through that. So yeah, that awareness, it's so key. And then really getting proactive with how you do things different. I hope that answers the question. I kind of went all over the place.
No, it's super helpful. And I'm really glad that you mentioned this idea that it's all of our parents. And now you're a parent, now I'm a parent, and I'm sure doing something to screw our kids up that we don't understand yet.
Totally.
But yeah, I guess maybe after we have kids, we become a little more empathetic towards our parents because we're like, oh my God, you had to deal with this. But parents are different than us. They're different people, right? But you also mentioned that they lived in different times and different environments and came from different places. And, one example of that is really interesting where I remember, this woman, she wasn't sure she wanted to have a baby, and she was saying she was getting a lot of pressure from her family because her family, like her mother had 3 kids and her grandmother had 5 kids, and she hasn't even had 1 kid yet. And, it's this really interesting thing about her feeling judged that she doesn't have as many children as her mother and her grandmother. But if you look at the population of the planet and the norms of what's happening now, well, there aren't that many people who have lots of children now anyway. So I think we have to be very kind to ourselves, as women and men, when we are trying to compare ourselves to other people, but also to compare ourselves to our parents who lived in completely different times.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of those examples, I think, is, you mentioned earlier about how we just accepted what the doctor did. And I think that this idea of the trust that we place in doctors is like a really big theme that comes up a lot in my work. And it's interesting because I noticed that in your book, in all 3 sections, you have, this is like a nerdy author structural question on the book, which is, okay, so in your first section on pregnancy and your second section on birthing, there is a section in there because they all address relationships and fear and worry, like every section of the book. So relationships and fear and worry in all of the stages. And then I noticed in the pregnancy and in the birthing sections, there's a lot about medical providers, but there's not a lot about the medical providers in the mommy section. I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if that was intentional. I was curious about that on your end.
That's a great point. And it wasn't like a conscious choice to leave that out. Maybe just kind of thinking about what I covered with pregnancy and birth. I guess maybe a hope was that a lot of the suggestions with, finding somebody that you really trust, finding somebody that you can be open with, that hopefully that would bleed over into motherhood, finding that OB or a midwife that you trusted enough to guide you through childbirth, that they would also, well, again, with midwives, their care ends at a certain point, but especially if you find this OB that you really trust and, you know that you can have those open conversations with them, that they would also be supporting you in the postpartum phase. And then to, apply those same tools to finding that pediatrician and, just really being discerning and knowing that you can switch care providers, which I really get into in regards to childbirth. It's like if you have a care provider that you just don't trust, you're not vibing with them, you have every right to find somebody new, even though that can be a little uncomfortable. And if obviously the same applies, with your medical care provider during, that postpartum phase for babies, medical care provider, each doctor, each pediatrician is not created equal, especially for each unique individual, right? They all have such different views and different ideas about how to guide you through certain issues. So yeah, that's so funny. Yeah, I didn't intentionally leave out that section in that postpartum phase, but yeah. So hopefully women get empowered during the pregnancy and birth sections to find somebody that, they really connect with and then apply that to the postpartum phase.
You talked about the kind of, super taboo things from the book, like if your partner strays from you during pregnancy or, that. Is that common?
Yeah. So I was shocked to find out that about 10% of partners do stray, when the woman is pregnant. And something else that was interesting, that a lot of the research that was done was, on heterosexual couples, but they actually found that a lot of same-sex couples, the same applies. And there's two main factors that were pinpointed as the potential cause. One was, a lot of pregnant women, especially during that first trimester, when you feel sick, maybe your libido is lower, you're just not as interested in sex and, that physical contact. And so some partners, go and seek out that physical affection somewhere else. And then a lot of pregnant women, we are going through so much emotionally and don't have as much space to support our partners through, any tricky things that they might be going through emotionally. And so that the researchers found that was another potential reason, was the pursuit of that emotional connection that a lot of times would lead to a physical relationship outside of the relationship with the pregnant woman. So those are the two main reasons that they found. But then, of course, I really emphasize, any women that are like, oh my God, is this going to happen? That you are not a statistic, right? Each couple is very unique. And I think it's important, like this question actually came from my own experience because I had this fear come up when I was pregnant with my son. My husband now, he was just my partner at the time. We weren't married, which it doesn't make a difference with this. But I just had this fear come up like, oh my God, what if he's unfaithful? And this was not based on anything that he was doing. It was just this huge concern I had. And so I started doing lots of research about it. And unfortunately, I wasn't good at researching then. So it was just kind of a dead end. And what I talk about in the book and what I finally did was I communicated. I shared this fear with him and we worked through it. So I wanted to make sure that I provided something like that in the book for women that, are concerned, to give them information about, yes, this does happen sometimes. Here's some potential reasons, but here's, how to navigate this fear and work through it. And then, of course, I had to acknowledge in the book that, if infidelity is happening, and obviously I tried not to be prescriptive, like this is what you do if your partner cheats, because obviously there's so many different ways to navigate that. But I really wanted to address it. And I shared my own fears. That was such a vulnerable piece of writing this book, is like, all right, I'm going to be writing about this stuff. I got to be open about how, I had these questions and how I navigated it. So long story short, it is something that happens, but there's ways to navigate it.
You really did go for it. I'm really happy that you shared these personal experiences. And, it's like these thoughts come up for people, and there's nothing worse than worrying about something and then just to keep worrying about it. And the thing that's so great about having a book like this is that you could actually know that, some other people have that experience too. And sometimes it does happen, and a lot of times it doesn't happen. And these are the things that, we could do to like maybe not have that happen, in terms of, because you do talk a lot about the relationship in the book.
Yeah.
And even your book, Feng Shui Mommy, that you wrote a few years ago, books really help us develop greater concentration in an area, right? So you're writing essentially about paying attention to and influencing the environment and the spaces where you live or where you are, in that book especially, right?
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot more to that book, but the reason that I'm bringing that up is because that was a really big theme of my book as well, the Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility, this theme of nesting and developing the relationship. Like I actually had a whole, chapter on the partner and the partner's health and stuff in the book, and the relationship, because this theme of nesting is so important for women. And, part of that is a relationship building. I would love to hear from you a little bit on why nesting well is so important.
Yeah. So our physical space impacts us so much, right? Even if we're not consciously aware of it. Like I am somebody that is very conscious of, how my space impacts me. I think I'm a very sensitive person in regards to, how my five senses are impacted in a space. And, when you look at becoming a mother, a lot of times what happens, and it's usually a great thing for the mother and baby, is especially for those first few months, you spend a significant amount of time at home. And I feel like so many women have that natural urge to nest because they know, okay, this is going to be my sanctuary and I need to make it into a sanctuary, a space where I feel good and safe and whole because motherhood, we don't have as much sleep. I mean, there's so many things thrown at us, right? And so having that nurturing physical environment to be in, it can give us this secure base. It's like, all right, I feel tired. I feel confused about motherhood, but I feel good sitting in my bedroom or my living room. Like my home does feel like an incredibly nurturing space to settle into. So I think, even for women that, again, typically, aren't really aware of their space. Like I have friends that they're like, yeah, like I kind of like my clutter. It doesn't really like bother me to not have a really clean house. Those women, I'm thinking about one in particular, when she got into the third trimester, all of a sudden this switch flipped and she's like, oh my God, all the clutter is bugging me now. Like I need to get my husband to help me clean more. And she became, again, a lot more sensitive to it, I think, because her, her mind, her body, her spirit was preparing her for the fourth, quote unquote, fourth trimester, those first 3 months of baby's life, where her home was going to be the main setting she was exposed to. So yeah, I think nesting is crucial. I feel like I'm kind of always in a state of nesting because I'm such a homebody. But yeah, it's especially important for women moving into motherhood.
No, thank you so much. And you shared that you're pregnant now, right?
Yes, I am. Yeah, almost 20 weeks, halfway through.
Yeah. And not to bring up, because it sounds like you had a miscarriage while you were writing the book in the process. And not to talk too much about it, because I know when we're pregnant, we want to talk about positive things. But I guess, not talking about that experience itself, whatever you're comfortable with, right? But how did that really affect you writing this book?
Yeah, it did. So the miscarriage happened probably about a month before I, turned in the book. But of course, we still had a lot of editing in front of us. And so there's two main questions in the book, that navigate like the pregnant woman's relationship with, a loved one. Or there's one question about, your relationship with a loved one who has had a miscarriage or, a stillbirth, a pregnancy loss, or can't get pregnant. And then one for women that have had a pregnancy loss and now have a lot of, fear when they become pregnant again. And so for obvious reasons, my perspective on both of those shifted a bit. I've had a lot of experience with those that I love having pregnancy loss and really did a lot of research and tried to make sure I did those questions justice. But of course, personally going through that gave me so much more insight. So I edited those questions to reflect my own experience. And like, for example, just one thing that's coming up, I had a lot of jealousy after having my miscarriage. I had two female cousins. We all got pregnant at the same time. I had a miscarriage and they went on to have healthy babies. And so, of course, I would like to think of myself as that person that's like, oh, I'm sad for myself, but I'm so happy for them. But that was really hard. If I'm being honest with myself, I felt resentful. I felt so jealous. So that was an interesting thing that came up that I, in some ways, address in the book. And let's see, helping the women that are going to be, interacting with people like I was like 8 months ago who had a pregnancy loss, and now you're interacting with this loved one who is pregnant, just how to compassionately move through that relationship, and to, as much as possible, when you're the one that's pregnant, not get your hackles up if the person who lost their baby doesn't want to be around your pregnant belly, doesn't want to be around your baby. And I have a close friend right now who's dealing with infertility. And I reference the book all the time before, we meet up, to make sure that, I really practice what I preach, and I am as compassionate as possible with her. Because it was a type of pain that I have never experienced before, and it brought a lot of fear and all sorts of stuff into this current pregnancy. But it totally transformed how I navigated those questions. And again, just on a personal level, how I'm navigating this pregnancy, and then my relationships with women that are struggling with what I went through as well.
This book is super brave. It's just, you really went after a lot of sensitive things that other people experience and that you've experienced yourself. And I'm really grateful that you've done that work. And so I know you're going to help a lot of people with this book, and, this idea of the business of baby making, right? Whether we're doing it for money or not, right? We're in the business of baby making. And it's like a startup company, right? Certain companies, they got the right board of advisors, and they got enough funding, and the market was ready for it. And there's like so many factors. And, it's like, it's amazing that life even happens, right? And I love that, you brought up a couple times this thing that I'm sure men do it too, but it seems like women in particular do a lot of this, like comparing and contrasting things with our lives a lot. And it's really great to know that other people have experienced something as well, not from like, let me continue feeling this way, but just to sort of like, this is okay, just to even feel like, it's okay anyway, right? It's okay for you to feel whatever you feel anyway, but it's sometimes helpful to know that somebody else felt that way too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, last question for you.
Okay.
What does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
Oh, that's a great question. God, in so many ways, it means everything. And that's become, so apparent to me in the last year, navigating the miscarriage and then a new pregnancy, tuning into my body. I've realized that it is so incredibly wise with helping me, guiding me with what I need to eat, how I need to move, how I need to nurture it. I'm in awe of the wisdom of the body. In so many ways, it knows so much more than I do about what I need to feel, vibrant. Yeah, I'm in awe of it.
I'm so happy to have you on the Wisdom of the Body podcast today, and so lovely to meet you. And I'd love for you to share with the audience how they could get in touch with you and find your book or books.
Yeah. So kind of the best hub is my website, baileygaddis.com. And it, has links to guide you to the books. Both books are available from, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, all the places where books are sold. But on my website as well, you can find my blog, all my social media accounts. There's a way to contact me, personally, privately through email. There's everything you want to know about me is on the website. And you can access all of my things from there.
And it sounds like there's a lot of open book stuff in your world, Bailey.
Yes. Definitely.
Your YouTube channel has some great videos.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely an open book. Yeah. Ask me anything and I'll tell you.
That's cool. Well, so lovely to meet you, and thanks for being here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Heather.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.